Okay, thanks. And I'm very grateful both to MOSF and KDI for the invitation to be here. This is really an exciting first visit to Korea for myself. Okay. So we've seen the sharing economy, and I kind of agree with the definition put forward by Dr. Huang this morning, that the characteristics of the sharing economy are really two-sided platforms, technology-enabled platforms that allow buyers and sellers to get together to share a good or a service that might not otherwise have easily been facilitated. And I'm not going to go into a reintroduction of these since we've talked about these extensively today. Instead, I'm going to zoom in and focus specifically on Airbnb in the accommodation sharing sector. So we've now heard from Julian a primer on what Airbnb is, a social website that connects people. And Airbnb is really an exemplifying technology in many ways. This is the listing of my co-author, Davide Proserpio, who's a PhD student. He pays for his entire rent for himself, his girlfriend, and his roommate by renting out an extra room in their apartment close to MIT and Harvard, where they can rent that room out through Airbnb and make back their entire rent for the whole apartment all year. He keeps it busy. He's an innkeeper. He keeps this room full 365 days a year, more or less, and charges market rates for a simple but very useful room for visiting students and postdocs. So what we were thinking of as academics was there's been a lot of discussion of the benefits of the sharing economy, and those are very clear-cut, but I think there are broader implications, and one thing that we are particularly interested in is a motivating question, is this question, is Airbnb creating purely incremental demand beyond what was already there, or is it impacting materially incumbent industries? In particular, is it substituting for certain hotel stays? We think, based on our own experience, that it's quite likely because we can see by renters like Davide that people who probably would have stayed in a hotel had they had the option are preferring and substituting an Airbnb rental. And we were wondering what the prevalence of this is. So what I'll talk about today, it's going to be somewhat of a technical talk. I apologize, there are even some formulas and equations in my talk. It's a slimmed down version of the slides that are in your presentation, so don't worry, I won't go through all of this lengthy talk that's there. But what I will cover is I'm going to give evidence of substitution effects that are occurring, try to quantify those, and explore some other implications. For example, how are impacts distributed by type of hotel? We find a differentiated impact across the hotel industry. We're going to explore a little bit how hotels are responding to the challenge that arises from Airbnb. And we're also going to touch on things that were in Julian's talk a little bit, which is how is Airbnb supply, how are rooms in Airbnb different from hotel room supply? And what impacts does that have on the sharing economy industry? And for full details, I'll reference you to this paper that's a collaboration between myself and a former PhD student who's at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University, Yorgos Zervas, and another PhD student who's finishing his work and is on the job market with some job offers, so hopefully he'll have a nice job by next year. Okay, in terms of this question, is Airbnb substituting for hotel stays? We have kind of three reference points, three exhibits, if you will, that I'll present. And the first is studies that were commissioned by Airbnb, which clearly demonstrate the very large positive economic impact in the principal Airbnb markets. So Airbnb has commissioned studies in New York, London, Barcelona, Berlin, Paris, and others to show that over the course of a given year, the revenue derived from guests, not just in terms of the stays, but also in terms of the restaurant industry and other tourism these guests generate, is very large. So New York, hundreds of millions of dollars in 2014, hundreds of thousands of guests. And what these studies posit also is that this does not displace hotel revenue, by and large, that these are guests who are staying in different parts of the city, probably are not or would not have used hotels otherwise, and presuppose, more or less, that these stays are incremental revenue. So that's Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 is mass media representations that either the sharing economy is something that's purely good, or that sharing economy has some downsides. Some of the headlines, for example, is the sharing economy an opportunity or a threat, I think is a very good question. Or the New York Times headline at the top right, Airbnb grows to 1 million rooms and hotel rivals are quiet for now. Kind of a curious phenomenon, maybe indicating that, in fact, Airbnb is right and their stays are more or less incremental. And then exhibit 3 is kind of observational data. So for example, we're going to take a look at Airbnb versus hotels. And on the right plot, what I have there in blue is in the city of Austin in Texas, where there's a large university, UT Austin. The blue dots represent hotels, and the red dots represent the incidence of Airbnb, the scattergram that Julian was referring to. So Marriott is representing, as of last year, that Airbnb is an interesting experiment that's fun to watch. But if you look carefully and watch carefully about how Airbnb is growing, I think it's, at least in Austin, is more perhaps of a threat than an interesting experiment. So if you do the time lapse and watch how many Airbnb listings arise in the course of 7 years in the state of Texas, it's an enormous flood of listings that are competing. In terms of the total net demand, it's 23,000 hotel rooms. By 2014, it was 8,000 Airbnb rooms, so about a third of the hotel room supply. Okay, so it's significant. This is one of the most prevalent places where Airbnb is becoming a competitor, I would say, to hotels, and I'll give evidence for that. Okay, so this is the question. Is Airbnb an experiment, an interesting experiment, or is it more of an industry disruptor? And what we've done is an observational study. We've tried to examine this question in a region of particular interest where we can really tease apart and try to understand what is the impact on hotels. And what we did was we studied the state of Texas. Earlier today, people were asking me, why Texas? What's good about Texas? There's a technical reason, and I'll describe that in a moment, that Texas has quite a bit of diversity. There are regions in Texas where Airbnb didn't really become much of an impact, and other places in Texas where Airbnb grew to a very large impact. So we can see what happens in regions with low Airbnb adoption and high versus high Airbnb adoption. Moreover, the timing of Airbnb penetration varies. Some places saw Airbnb adoption occurring very early and very rapidly, like Austin. Other cities, like Dallas, see a good degree of Airbnb adoption, but much later in the period. So we get a differential view about different spatial and temporal dynamics of Airbnb coming into a marketplace which has diversity. So that was one good reason for our study in Texas, and another one was the data that we could collect in Texas. So Texas has a fortunate attribute for our study that tax revenue is publicly available. So what we were able to acquire, in part from this publicly available data and also from a firm that works with the hospitality industry called STR, was we got a very good detailed look at both the attributes of hotels in Texas as well as revenue data set. So there are about 3,700 Texas hotels. STR categorizes them by what price category they're in addition to how much meeting space they have for businesses, which turns out to be important in our study, as well as their precise location. And the revenue data set consists of quarterly observations. So for each one of these hotels, over a 10-year period, we know how much revenue they had in that quarter. Okay, and after some data cleaning, we came to 3,000 unique hotels spanning 154 cities in Texas. In addition to the hotel data set, we're going to cross-reference that with the Airbnb data set. We collected our own data from the Airbnb.com website, spanning all of the listings in Texas, which turned out to be 14,000 listings from 10,500 hosts. So some hosts have multiple listings, and that's as of 2014. We also knew precisely where each listing was and the date of the market entry, the time the listing appeared. So again, our identification strategy, or the model that we're going to build, is going to exploit this geographic and temporal variation. You can see that hotels and Airbnb are not distributed in the same way in Texas. Hotels are concentrated in urban areas, but they're scattered over more or less every small city in the entire state, whereas Airbnb is concentrated really in certain specific demographies. And as I mentioned, the penetration rate in terms of how much supply of Airbnb rooms there are varies over time. Of course, it's going up rapidly, but that rapid growth differs from city to city, and Austin being the place in Texas which has by far the most supply. Okay, there are a couple of different ways you might want to study Airbnb adoption. In our study, what we look at is we look at city-level granularities. So we think of hotels as competing potentially with all of the Airbnb listings at a city level. We think travelers are relatively unlikely to substitute a stay in one hotel for an Airbnb stay in a totally different city, but we think it reasonable to assume that the level of competition might be within a city. There are a couple of other alternative ways to measure supply, but we consider those in the paper, but I'm not going to discuss those further here. And here's the methodology we're going to use. This is a widely used methodology both in econometrics, also in epidemiology and other scientific disciplines, where you study the influences of two groups. In one group, the blue group is going to be unexposed to Airbnb. Or in a medical context, you could think of those as the patients who are not going to receive a treatment or who would receive a placebo. Their revenue, maybe it trends upward over time. Hotels might be doing quite well. Trends upward over time. Airbnb comes into the market, but these hotels aren't impacted at all. They're the control group. They're in regions with low Airbnb penetration. Contrast that with the red hotels. The red hotels are also experiencing just a normal trajectory prior to Airbnb entry. Then Airbnb comes into the market differentially with heavier magnitude impact as time goes on. And perhaps it continues with a parallel trend. Or perhaps what we see is that these treated hotels observe an impact from Airbnb coming into the market, as we hypothesize. So this is a strategy which can be explored using a differences in differences regression model. And that's what I'm going to briefly describe to you, and then we'll show you the results from that model. Now, one key assumption in differences models is that you have a kind of a key assumption that no city-specific, time-varying unobservables are correlated with Airbnb adoption. That's a mouthful, and the translator is probably having a hard time translating that into Korean. But what it means is that there's not something else which is causing a decline that can be explained by an alternative hypothesis other than this Airbnb adoption. But to be a problem, it's very challenging. It has to have the right shape, both in time and in geography, to cause the same effect that Airbnb is having. And that's why it's so important to have temporal and spatial variation, which gives our model so much richness. And the large number of observations gives our study a lot of nuance in terms of being able to pinpoint an effect. Okay, I'm not going to speak much about identification checks, but I think I will say this much, that in constructing such a model, it is quite difficult to be careful that you're not observing things or not being cautious to explain alternative reasons why the phenomena that you're seeking might not be operative. And one such check, I'll just mention the first bullet on this slide, is that when we place a relatively simple model around the data, then most of the variation in Airbnb supply can be explained by city fixed effects, which I'll describe, time fixed effects, and a city-specific trend. Which is to say, much of the data in our model can be explained by relatively simple phenomenon, and there aren't missing pieces that we don't understand and can't see. The amount of error that we see from these unknown effects is relatively small. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead, except to say that one of the nice things that we have access to is we had a long pre-Airbnb period to study. Our hotel data set had information for many years prior to when Airbnb was in the market. So we could ask questions like, were there good predictors that were in that data when Airbnb wasn't even a vision in the founder's eyes that might be able to predict Airbnb adoption later in the future? And the answer was no. There was nothing that we could discern in that preceding data that would lend itself to describe features in the subsequent data. Okay, I think I'm going to just say one word about this slide. So there are a couple of different factors you might want to consider when trying to predict future Airbnb supply. Some were not highly predictive, and some were predictive, and those we incorporated into our model. For example, population turned out to be a good predictor, weak predictor, but a predictor of how well Airbnb would have an uptake. And I think other researchers are working on sort of understanding the factors of what makes Airbnb amenable to being successful in a community. So for the Korean economy, understanding those works, which try to determine which predictors are going to do well in terms of predicting whether Airbnb is going to have an uptake, might be ones worth studying. Okay, I'm going to show you one hard equation. So this is it. So this is our specification. What are we trying to understand? We're trying to understand whether the hotel revenue data, which we have with 3 indices, we have it by hotel in each city in each Texas, in each quarter. So we have basically a 3-dimensional matrix on which we have hotel revenue. We primarily wonder, does Airbnb supply, do Airbnb rooms impact hotel revenue? If so, what we would see in this linear regression is we would see that when Airbnb supply rises, hotel revenue goes down. In other words, what we'd expect to see is that if you see that coefficient beta, we'd expect to see that rising Airbnb supply has a negative beta, which means it will cause hotel revenue to be lower. The other terms in our model, in addition to Airbnb supply, are control variables. We have controls for each hotel, which provides a baseline revenue for that hotel. We have a time-varying variable, which determines the typical revenue for each quarter. And then we have additional control variables. Okay, so this is the basic model that we study in the paper. All of our results work on derivative models that either refine this basic model or look at specific attributes and investigate deeper differentiated questions that derive from this model. So what are our main findings? So our findings were fourfold. So first up, we associated each 10% increase in Airbnb listings to what seems like a small decrease in hotel revenue of about 0.4%. I apologize, this slide is not in your slide packet, but is summarized in 4 sequential plots. Okay, so you have more information that is on this slide. So about 0.4% decrease, which doesn't sound like much, but then if you interpret, well, how much does Airbnb grow over time, this effect has to be multiplied by the very large growth over time. In effect, this translates to approximately an 8% decrease in hotel revenue in Austin, Texas, where Airbnb's supply is largest. So something like getting close to a 10% impact on hotel revenues is what our model is showing. Another factor which some other experts have found interesting is we found that an Airbnb supply, so one additional Airbnb listing, you can compare that to adding an additional hotel room. So one Airbnb listing is about as much impact as a competitor adding other way around. 4 Airbnb listings is about the same impact as one additional hotel room at a competitor. So that gives you a sense of the nature and magnitude of the substitutability. Okay, and there are additional robustness checks in the paper. Okay, so moving on, I think. Okay. Another question is, well, how do hotels respond? So publicly, they're saying Airbnb is not much of a threat, but we can look in the data and say, well, what is actually happening? Is it the case that they are doing nothing, or can we see a response in the data? There are really 2 ways hotels could respond. they could potentially have a decrease in occupancy rate, or they could potentially decrease prices. Using a similar identification strategy to the one I've already described, you can see that the impacts on Airbnb supply, both with respect to occupancy rate and room price, and now treating those as dependent variables, both have a negative impact on Airbnb supply. And what this translates to is that the majority of the response that we see, about 3-to-1 factor, is a price response. So what we estimate is that Airbnb's impact on room price is about 5%. Now again, this has to be taken in the context of a market where hotel prices are by and large going up. So this 5% is in the counterfactual versus a setting where Airbnb never came into existence. And a reason that the Airbnb impact may be hard to discern is because hotels, a rising tide lifts all boats, hotels' prices on average are going up, yet the places where Airbnb is coming into existence is dampening the magnitude of the price increase. Another question we want to ask is, what are the impacts across hotels? You could view this either as a refinement to the model, or as a check, a sanity check against the validity of the model. And we would think Airbnb probably doesn't affect all hotels in the city in the same way. We believe, and other pundits who study Airbnb think Airbnb is probably less attractive for those consumers who are less price sensitive. So those consumers who are going to luxury hotels anyway probably don't really care about Airbnb. And also for business travelers who use conference facilities, such as the ones we're in, are probably a little bit less likely to use Airbnb as an option. And indeed, our data bears that out. So one way to incorporate that into our model is taking the model that we have before. We now add the second line of the model is the only thing that's changed, where we cross-reference Airbnb supply with a hotel type to check the impact of Airbnb supply when we also look at the hotel type effects. And what we find is straight down the line, budget and economy hotels are seeing the most impact, the largest effects, and the higher end hotels are the ones that are least affected. And just straight down the line, the impact is highest to lowest, just ranked by those 5 classifications in the STR survey. We also find that hotels such as this one, the Grand Intercontinental, with a large amount of meeting space, is the type of hotel that's least likely to be affected by Airbnb, as you'd expect. Hotels with amenities that business travelers care about are those that are probably hardest for Airbnb to replicate, and the places where substitution is least likely to occur. And finally, the last thing that we've been taking a look at is to try to address the challenge, is Airbnb different, fundamentally different from hotel rooms? Is accommodation sharing providing something essentially different from hotel rooms? Does it go beyond just unique spaces in unique places that cater to travelers? And we think the answer is yes, and I think there's a clear-cut reason why Airbnb supply is different. The case study that we look into is a famous festival called South by Southwest, SXSW, that occurs in Austin, Texas, for about a 10-day period every year. In South by Southwest, it's predictable, it happens every year, but it's a surge of guests coming to a local municipality. Last year, 2,500 Airbnb hosts welcomed more than 11,000 guests from over 50 countries during this period. And Airbnb itself, the source here is Airbnb.com, the number of guests who have stayed in Airbnb properties during South by Southwest is continuously growing. So roughly 16% of South by Southwest attendees attended Airbnb. And Austin residents earned almost $8 million from this in 2014. What does this say about hotels? Well, what hotels can no longer do is charge very high prices during these times of peak demand. Airbnb supply can flexibly onboard more guests during these peak periods and crimp hotels' pricing power. And we've seen that borne out in the data. On the left-hand plot, we're plotting South by Southwest attendance over the course of the past 20 years. And on the right-hand plot, what you're looking at is the change in prices of hotels year over year. And what you can see in the data, which has statistical significance, is in the period from 2006 to 2011, hotels were able to, every year, command a larger peak prices during these periods than the previous year. But in the past 4 years, you can see that these peak pricing power is not as strong. And we think this is predominantly due to Airbnb being able to cut into this particular share of the market. Okay, so Airbnb can flexibly scale supply. We heard some examples of that. South by Southwest, the President's Cup golf tournament that was held here a few weeks ago would be another example of that. The World Cup, the Pope visits. And we're seeing hotel prices during these peak demands start to resemble off-peak prices. Okay, so here's a recap of our main findings. We found that Airbnb does provide a viable alternative for certain hotel stays, not all. And we find that the impact is non-uniformly distributed, with, to date, lower-priced hotels and hotels that don't cater to business travelers being the ones that are the most affected. And what we've seen in Texas is that when affected hotels experience a decrease in demand, they've been exhibiting a price response. And then in this recent slide, we saw that Airbnb's supply differs from hotel supply, particularly because it can scale up supply on demand. Those homeowners who might not put their house or listing on the market in most times might well do so during South by Southwest and limit hotels' pricing power then. Looking back and thinking holistically about the accommodation sharing industry, I think there are a couple of different key players who have findings here. So I think our study has largely been about hotels. So we're seeing evidence that Airbnb is successfully competing and slowly but surely acquiring some market share from incumbent firms. And we see some important advantages, mostly in flexibility and adaptability, which enables Airbnb. Zero marginal cost. It's very easy for a new homeowner to place a listing on Airbnb. Very, very simple transaction. So adding new inventory is relatively easy if a homeowner wants to do that. Listings are highly personalized. They can cater toward a specific audience. They can do marketing at a very fine scale. And the listings are searchable. So to be able to find a property that's really suitable for you is something that's enabled by technology. It's relatively unregulated, which may lead to lower prices, although as Julian mentioned, Airbnb is encouraging to pay taxes. And the online experience at Airbnb is extremely good. As an Airbnb guest myself, I know that searching those listings, identifying a home is something that's very convenient, maybe more so than many hotel websites. For travelers, there are clear benefits to those travelers who use accommodation sharing options. But what's interesting, I think, is that this evidence that the hotel market share is being impacted by Airbnb means that the increased competition is benefiting all travelers, not just the ones who are using Airbnb, but also those other travelers who are benefiting from lower prices. And of course, there's the natural benefit of a greater and diverse supply of options for travelers. For cities and municipalities, I think it's a little bit of a mixed story, but much more favorable than not. So on the favorable side, Airbnb is surely generating new tourism because this is an imperfect substitute, so much of the demand is in fact incremental. So that implies new travel revenue for cities. But there may be some risks, especially in potentially losing revenue in the event Airbnb hosts do not pay taxes or pay less taxes than a comparable stay would have incurred at a hotel. Okay, I'll close in the last minute with the fact that sharing raises many other questions, some of which have been covered today, some of which will be covered tomorrow. And the accommodation sharing really is at the crux of these because it touches on many of the angles. So the cost and benefit of the sharing economy is something we've already talked about. Maybe we haven't talked so much about substantial job creation, but I think micro-entrepreneurs who are listing their homes are making substantial income, very substantial income. They can be their own innkeepers, for example, and derive a great deal of revenue for this. So new jobs and new incomes are benefits realized by the accommodation sharing industry. We haven't talked so much about this, but there's negative externalities potentially that are generated in accommodation sharing. For example, when new people are constantly coming and going into a neighborhood. So increased foot traffic, less of a community sense when people are renting out their homes all the time. Regulation and taxation we've talked about earlier today. I won't go into more examples. We've sort of thought carefully about which regulations and which taxation environments would be right for different industries. I'm not an expert in this area, but maybe we'll hear more prescriptions tomorrow. And finally, we've heard trust bandied about. Some of my other work studies the effect of different trust and reputation mechanisms on different platforms. And I think it's quite apparent, at the very least, that having different trust and reputation mechanisms on the sites can definitely enhance the user experience. And I think what Airbnb has hit upon, and Uber as well, with hosts reviewing guests and guests reviewing hosts, this bilateral feedback engenders a level of trust that seems genuine and real and substantial. So on the downside, we wonder is trust enough? Because reviews might not be enough, for example, to guarantee a user's safety. So some level of security, but maybe not total safety. So I think that's all I have for you. Thank you very much for your attention.